Okay, it's 10:30 sharp. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to our session titled Youth Protection Through Inclusion and Empowerment, Rebuttal of the Exclusion-Based Narrative. I am Yassine. I use they, he pronouns. I'm an anti-racism expert as well as digital rights advocate. And today I'll be moderating this awesome panel. But before we get into that, I really want to hear from you. So I'll be reading a couple of sentences, and please, if you agree, raise your hand. And if you disagree, don't do nothing. I would understand myself. So starting with a little basic, age verification is a protective tool. Okay, panelists, you can also participate if you feel like it. Awesome. Age verification is authoritarian tool. Cute. Age verification is racist and migrant phobic. Age verification is transphobic. Period. What this just showed us is exactly why this conversation matters. We might all say that we want to protect children and young people online, but we clearly do not agree on what protection means, what it looks like, or what cost comes with it. Because these policies are not neutral and definitely not experienced equally. For some, age verification feels like a reasonable protective tool. For others, it means surveillance, exclusion, exposure, and the loss of access to spaces that are essential for community, knowledge, safety, and even survival. And yet, across Europe, restriction is increasingly being sold as the only path to protection, even amongst the most progressive ones. But there is something deeply contradictory about this. On one hand, we have the president of the European Commission saying, it's our duty to protect our children in the online world just as we do in the offline world. So the European Union is accelerating the rollout of digital age verification systems as the mere solution. And then we have, on the other hand, the European Union increasingly showing obsession with simplification and competitiveness, opening the doors to aggressive big tech, lobbying, and corporate influence over digital policy, while forgetting to hold them accountable. The focus is shifted towards restriction, punishing, and pushing young people and many marginalized adults out of the online spaces altogether. All of this while governments and institutions continue failing to properly enforcing existing protections around privacy, platform accountability, and digital rights, despite the facts that frameworks like Digital Services Act already provide tools to address many of these harms. And this is why we need to be honest about this today. Is this really about safety? Or is this about power and control? Who gets restricted, who gets monitored, and who is pushed out under the language of protection? Especially when the loudest voices in these debates come from positions of privileges. People who are documented, people who are white, people who are economically secured, cisgender, protected by borders, and removed from the realities of surveillance and institutional violence. The non-queer, the non-youth, the non-migrant, the refugees, and the non-BIPOC. Those who are convinced that they know what works for us better than us. But make no mistake, this panel is not for that. It's not to reproduce this moral panic, the saviorism, the tokenism, or the protective white parental lens. We are here to critically examine what happens when protection becomes censorship, when safety becomes surveillance, and when access to digital spaces become conditional. So remain open-minded, listen, not just hear, digest, and reflect, because you might also be part of the problem. With that being said, please help me welcome these superstars. We have Luisa Franco Machado, who's an award-winning digital rights advocate, founder and executive director of Equilabs. We have Simon de Brouwer, who's a policy advisor at EDRI, who's, by the way, hosting this panel. Thank you for having us. We have Stéphanie Rechani, who's an advocacy lead at Equinox, Initiative for Racial Justice. And we have Felix Reda, a senior director of developer policy at GitHub. Welcome. And to kick this off, I will ask you something beyond regulation, risk, protection, because that we're going to get later into it. I want to begin with a broader question. What do online spaces make possible for the communities you work with and belong to? And what is at stake when access to those spaces becomes restricted or conditional? Who wants to start first?
Happy to.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Felix. I look at this perspective from the perspective as a trans person. And I think one thing that is really important when it comes to online spaces for trans people is some people, they know they're trans when they are 3 years old and they are able to express this. But for a lot of us, this is not the case. Sometimes we find out maybe in adolescence or even later in life. And quite often it's really, really important to be able to participate in online spaces of trans communities anonymously at first. Like a lot of people, especially if you're living in a transphobic environment, which is most of us to some extent, but certainly some places are worse than others, it's really a question of personal safety to be able to learn about the realities of trans people without having to identify yourselves. And another thing that plays into this is that we don't necessarily have a very positive relationship to our official identity documents if we are privileged enough to even have them, because they often don't reflect the name and gender that we choose for ourselves. And so if the entry barrier to participate in online communities is having to show your ID somewhere, there is a real risk of both exclusion but also of self-censorship, because I think there is a real fear of being discovered if you're not out in public or if you are in an environment where being trans is being sanctioned. And even if the technologies that are being offered are supposedly privacy preserving, you have to be able to actually trust that. And we have seen examples, for example, like Discord, I think, had identity documents that were collected for age verification leaked online. And this is, of course, sort of a trans person's worst nightmare. And so, yeah, I think it's important to be able to find your community online, especially like if you're a trans person, your parents are not necessarily in a position to help you. Probably they have more questions about being trans than you have and might even need some hand-holding and emotional support from their children when they're coming out rather than the other way around. So having access to other ways of finding community, including online spaces, is actually very important. And I see age verification as a barrier to that.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Louisa?
Yes. I think for me this topic is really personal because I don't think I would be doing this work if I hadn't been once an angry teenager online. I mean, I first found out about feminism on social media, and I remember feeling like someone had finally given me words for something that I had already been feeling. And this was at a really particular time where you're a teenager, you're at school, you're finding out things about yourself, about others, about society, and you need to find a community also to validate that. So when I was being called an angry feminist at school, it's when I found other angry feminists online that I realized that actually, no, we were talking about a bigger systemic problem. And then this even went further because when this happened and I wanted to create a community somewhere, I was like, okay, you know what, let's take this offline and let me create some collective at school with friends and with other young women. And then my school was the super conservative German school in Brazil. And they were like, no, you cannot create a collective. What do you mean, organizing when you're 15? Insane. So I was like, okay, let's just do it online. So that's when we created the sort of underground feminist collective online. And so then when I think about age verification and social media bans, I'm also thinking of this version of me and all of the angry feminists out there that are looking for a community and that are really just finding out about oppression, but need the words and spaces for that. So that's for them and for us.
Thank you. And your German school was terrible for sure. Steffi?
I'll go then. I approach this from a professional and personal perspective as well. On the personal side, I was a rural youth neurodivergent on the autism spectrum, and online spaces were really critical to my well-being, not because I socialized, but because I found so much information and so much solace in being there, because the real life offline is not a place where I can fully be myself easily. So on the personal side, it was very important to have these spaces. On the professional side, I work with human rights defenders, grassroots citizen organizations, hacker organizations, NGOs more broadly, for whom the project of the free and open internet is not something that can be reined in through protection that presents itself through the veil of use or through the veil of censorship, which presents itself through the veil of protection, is not something valuable, because for these communities, criticism is key. Criticism of power, truth to power, the ability to share information, to find information, and to share code is extremely important for this community, and the principles behind that are deeply at risk with measures which restrict who can say and who can access certain spaces. So this is, for me, what is at stake.
Thank you. Steffi.
Yeah, not sure that there's that much more to add. I guess the same as everybody else saying here on this panel. Any somewhat marginalized community understands the value of access to these spaces. They are often life-saving, incredibly empowering, and also, yeah, mind-expanding, eye-opening, and that's very, very valuable, especially for children, which I would also consider a marginalized community in society, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, there's very little value, I agree completely, in exclusion or limitation. And I think without divorcing these measures from the reality that we live in now, when not just children, but everybody is increasingly more isolated, increasingly repressed, increasingly separated from their own communities for whatever reason, or the impact of pandemics on social contact or human contact at a minimum. I think these spaces offer an opportunity for people who would otherwise have no voice, no community, no way to advocate for themselves. And I think that's probably the most important thing, is that you are denying people a voice when you pretend that exclusion is a protective measure.
Mm-hmm. You made it easier for me to jump into the first question, actually, because the current policy, as you said, it's increasingly centered around restriction, age verification, bans, platform controls, and identity-based access. So, Simon, from your perspective, what are policymakers assuming these measures will solve, and what are they consistently failing to address underneath the surface?
I think the aim is to avoid early exposure to toxic content and addictive features, as if by delaying it, we improve the situation, as if young people automatically and necessarily become mature enough and competent enough on their own past a certain threshold age. However, this is very naive. It's very naive and it's dangerous, both for them, young people who get restricted, and for other people who are cast in the nets. By design, as we discussed in the previous panel, I think what consistently is not addressed is the fact that we all are exposed to these toxic content and addictive features, and that it's a collective issue. The main issue is that if we only protect young people, and they need to be protected, but if we only protect them, these harmful practices, they remain uncontested for all of us. Whereas what young people want, for having worked with them, is that even the adults they grow into get these protections that we are about to bring. young people want empowerment, and what we're bringing is exclusion. That sounds wrong. So if we look at this from this angle, what the policies consistently fail to address is the fact that these online spaces are harmful, and that we already have lots of rules to make them less harmful. It's as if the Australian model or American model or Chinese model, it's widespread now, were to solve anything, whereas we know young people don't want that approach. They bypass it if it's imposed onto them. And we're pushing an infrastructure of control which impacts everyone included, all the adults in the room as well. Whereas in parallel, we see a push to protect children that is very strong, but in parallel, we see budget cuts in education in all EU countries. We see at EU level the deregulation agenda that is watering down the acquis that protects everyone, young and less young alike. We see the undermining of EU laws enforcement by US administration with the dialogue. So, and also we see even the platforms, they do budget cuts in their moderation programs. So what we're doing with this approach is pretending to protect while consistently failing to protect the rules we have, enforce them, and bring true protection to society as a whole, I think.
I don't know why randomly I had an example in my mind, because what you're saying for me sounds like metaphorically when the US says that, oh, we want to protect children, but then have guns everywhere. I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. So why are you keeping these harmful practices and then you want to protect children is the most, is the frontline narrative that you're sold into to people. But I mean, Steffi, I'm going to go a little bit around this point and say, let's just imagine these are like actually protective practices. We know that protection is never experienced equally. So how do systems like age become high risk for migrants, refugees, undocumented people, or others already subjected to surveillance and exclusion? And why is that dimension so often missing from these conversations in both digital rights movements and at governmental level?
Well, I think I can start maybe with the sort of the second half of your question, which
Please.
is why this dimension is so often missing from these conversations. And it's a very, very easy, practical answer. It's that marginalized communities are also as much by design as by lack of intentionality left out of policymaking and decision-making spaces. They do not have the access that Facebook or Google or corporate giants will have to those institutions that have the power to make changes and impact their lives. The tech sector, I think, in Brussels alone spends 113 million euros per year on lobbying. I don't know what queer youth organization or migrant justice organization has that kind of money. My guess is none. Presence online, advocacy online, and campaigning, while it can be very, very powerful, and it is powerful and it is necessary, what is only usually ever a fraction of the influence that a multi-billion-dollar worldwide corporation can have, like impact versus impact. I think the risk that age verification and systems like that pose to people who are undocumented or people who are sex workers or people who are just visibly racialized or queer is that, number one, age verification systems are hugely flawed. We know that they will be propelled by AI or algorithms that are inherently biased and not neutral and set against particular communities, especially racialized ones. Age assessment overall in general in any policy area, digital spaces, asylum procedures is not something that is on its own or barely even at all, to be honest, a legitimate pathway to securing protection for anybody, not just those who are vulnerable, but the so-called people who require protection from us weirdos, I guess. Yeah. And maybe I am sorry, I know you asked the question of, can we take these at face value and let's pretend, but it's just not possible to. We don't live in a world where protection is equal or policymaking is equal or impacts are felt in the same way. And I think it would be wrong to have that as a jumping point and pretend that policymaking is neutral in any way or unbiased in any way. Same for AI, same for corporate interests, like there is a goal here and it's not protection and it's definitely profits, and that is clear. And so just challenging that premise alone, I think, is very, very important.
I'm gonna go off the script. I'm gonna ask you, because when I looked at this age verification app that's right now buzzing everywhere, I've read that it's gonna be neutral. And they're just gonna focus on the date of birth. As communities, do we believe that?
No.
Period.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
period, literally full stop, like no, full sentence, no, absolutely not. I think there's no possible way to ensure that data that is scanned and collected by a machine and stored and processed and controlled and shared, there's not enough safeguards in the world that could, and I'm sure Simeon has a more definitive tech take on this, but there's not enough safeguards in the world for a flawed policy of protection. So it's you're doing like prevention rather than cure, and on the way infecting people along the way. Just a terrible analogy, but do you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. The NGO I work for is EDRI, European Digital Rights. Being in this conference, that digital rights often reminds people of privacy and data protection alone, not thinking of other digital rights. But the whole scope is what I work on. And while we are being, in Europe, promised a privacy-preserving solution that is supposedly not going to be that invasive, that tracking that's much based on biometrics or algorithms, even if that were the case, which it's not looking good right now, how it's being built, but even if it were privacy-preserving as it best, it still is a tool of exclusion and censorship. So the best privacy-preserving censorship tool is still a censorship tool. It is still a tool which privileges exclusion over inclusion. And we believe that protection and the way we can ensure people's fundamental rights are respected, both in terms of positive and negative duties of the state, as was mentioned in the previous panel, is through empowerment and inclusion. Because otherwise, yes, we may have protected privacy in the way we exclude people, but the fundamental rights that we need to exercise online and offline, they are not saved by this privacy-preserving framework. So even if it were to address the problems we point to, it's still a very flawed approach to begin with.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add very quickly
Please.
that I think this is exactly what I mean when I try to say challenging this premise of this, you're told that the trade-off is between protecting children and autonomy and privacy and freedom of expression, and it's a false binary. It doesn't actually protect children, doesn't protect anybody, doesn't redirect resources into things that are actually needed, which Simeon already mentioned. And I think that's the challenge. That's the premise that needs to be consistently challenged in these spaces.
Amen. Now, similar to migrant communities, undocumented refugees, you name it, many trans communities, especially young trans people, find online spaces often fragile as infrastructures for knowledge, but also for recognition and self-determination in contexts where institutional safety is not guaranteed. So, Felix, what is lost when those infrastructures become conditional or governed through verification, access control, or restriction?
Yeah, I think these policies turn all young people into consumers and raise them to be consumers, right? So the perspective of the social media ban is that there are companies on the one hand that offer online spaces, and then there are people who consume what these companies have to offer. And a lot of trans people, but just young people in general, are actively participating in building the online communities that they're on. And by online communities, I don't mean a Facebook group. But this is very much the perspective, and I think we are going in this direction through these kinds of policies. You can see it in the UK, for example, who passed the Online Safety Act, where a lot of independent discussion forums that were run by the communities themselves, migrated from having their own technological infrastructure and their own community space to a Facebook group or a Discord server or some other infrastructure that is offered by a company that they don't control themselves. And so you mentioned at the beginning, I work for GitHub, and people might wonder, why is there an industry person on this panel? It's not just because CPDP likes to have multi-stakeholder panels, but maybe it's part of it. So GitHub is a software development platform, right? So people who build open source software are not looking at the internet as a place to be a consumer, but rather as a place where they can build something themselves. And I have friends, for example, who run their own Mastodon servers. So Mastodon is a free and open source software to operate a social network, kind of similar to X, but quite different. And it's decentralized. So basically, you don't have to have one single company that runs the infrastructure for you, even though there is Mastodon, the company, which runs the biggest of these servers. But yeah, people like my friends can run their own server, and they can all connect with each other, and you can talk to each other from server to server. And of course, you are completely killing this approach to social media if you're saying, in order to operate a social media, you have to install age verification. Because if you are basically a small group of private individuals, like, for example, the server that I'm on is run by a few people I know and trust personally. So I trust that the community norms that they set align with what I believe. I know this is a place that is safe for trans people, but they are more or less doing this in their free time. They are building their own norms around content moderation. They don't necessarily have the capacity to introduce something like an age verification system. And so if you are imagining social media to be something that can only be operated by large companies, then you will end up in a reality where it is only offered by large companies.
Wow. Thank you. Louisa, we missed your voice. So tell me, when public discourse constantly frames us as young people as vulnerable, at risk, in need of control, which is often framed as protection, what does that do not only to our rights, but to our sense of agency, belonging, and political imagination?
Yeah, I love this word, imagination, because what I find really striking in this debate is that young people are in everyone's mouths, right? They are used as a justification for policy, but they're much less present in the design of these policies. So our safety is given as a reason for age verification, for bans and restrictions, but the experiences that are cited as evidence that something has gone wrong is almost comes with this punishment idea that you should be punished because you are the victim. And when it comes to defining what protection should look like, which is something we've been talking, their role becomes suddenly much smaller. And I think that this is where this framing around vulnerability becomes quite politically limiting, because it recognizes that young people are affected, but it doesn't necessarily recognize that they have preferences, that they have demands, and that they have a stake in the trade-offs being made, which they understand usually quite well. If young people only enter policy processes as victims, the solution will always be rescue. And if they enter as political actors, the solution can become redistribution of power. I saw this very clearly at a panel that I was part of last week, where someone from a large child rights organization was talking about a campaign they had organized where they were raising awareness about the risks of social media to teenagers. And I found that really cute, because teenagers know a lot about the risks of social media. They live them. Girls know what harassment looks like. LGBTQIA young people know what targeting and humiliation can mean. So the issue is not that teenagers don't understand risk and they must be protected from it. I think is that their understanding of risk is rarely used as a basis for shaping policy. So a teenager's experience of harassment can be used to show that platforms are unsafe. But those same young people are much less often asked what actually makes them safer, what platforms should be forced to change, and what trade-offs they are or not willing to accept. Equilabs is a youth-led digital rights lab. And while we're not claiming to speak for every teenager and every minor, I think intersectionality here also plays a huge role. But what we have been trying to do, and quite successfully, if I may, is to build models for youth-led participation where young people's experiences can also become analysis and strategy and then policy demands. So for us, empowerment means building capacity to understand the systems shaping your life, organize with others, which is what social media bans take away from you, formulate demands, and then influence these processes and the institutions that are governing our lives. And that works. We have organized a youth-led manifesto and taken it to Davos. We also organized with the community a workshop on queer AI. Our common thread is that young people are not just sharing their experiences as like the victims, but then they are part of the co-building, the co-construction. And I think that this is what I understand about the age verification debate. And from my experience being a young person, but I'm not a teenager, but I haven't been a teenager that long ago, but also, working with teenagers, is that this age verification and social media bans reflect a certain idea of protection, which is that young people become safer when institutions create distance between them and risk. But also, they teach young people something really dangerous about power. They show that when institutions face a difficult social problem, the first response is to restrict people, often with the least institutional power. And then we should be asking what kind of relationship to democratic governance these policies create for those young people. So for me, the real harm is that these policies teach young people to see digital governance, which is something we all care about very deeply, as something that arrives from above, first as surveillance and then as restriction, all while removing any opportunity to mobilize and to contest. So I want a different starting point. I want a protection that means that young people can look at the systems shaping our lives and say, I have a right to understand this, to contest this, and to help change this. And this gives some agency that social media bans just cannot give.
Oh, wow. Wow. I mean, thank you. As a young person talking about that, thank you. Wow. I'm sorry, just fangirling over here. Sim, if we accept that restriction and surveillance are not actually resolving harm, and in many cases are producing new forms of exclusion, what would a genuinely right-based approach to online safety look like instead?
A rights-based approach would be one based on empowerment, and that's actually what young people have been calling for, so great. One thing I really liked from what you just said is that protection is not distance from risk, it's not putting you away from the risk. I think a rights-based approach, therefore, is one where we address the risk, we hold the platforms accountable, we confront the systems that produce harm first, instead of removing those most affected by it. There's a collective dimension there. There's also an individual perspective where a rights-based approach would be one where we enable people to confront these systems also at individual levels and to be resilient to risk, to be resilient to harm, and to have the competences to navigate online spaces, even if they're not perfect. That being said, we cannot assume that the problem can be solved if we focus only on young people. Again, the issue is systemic. Really, we all are harmed by the rabbit holes, toxic content, addictive features. That won't be resolved by focusing on one age group. And it will be made worse insofar as if we protect only youth, we leave the practices themselves uncontested, even legitimized for adults. Therefore, we need also to address the whole online ecosystem, and that's why maybe you all know the DSA, which is being enforced, which it takes time, but it's happening. That has a lot of potential, but we also need to be realistic. These rules we have may not cover every aspect of the online harm ecosystem, and therefore what we need to add through the Digital Fairness Act is structural fairness, is legal duties of cooperation between the different kinds of authorities that are relevant in the digital sphere. We need to address the addictive design, which cannot be turned on by default for anyone, youth or adult. We need to address the deceptive design itself, all the way this system is tweaked to make us do things we don't want. And finally, we need to address unfair personalization. Personalization is perhaps one of the roots of the problem as well. I believe we need the right to non-personalized systems by default. We need a guarantee that when we have non-personalized system, we have the full service, and that it's not dependent on us consenting to cookies or to practices. So that's I think core of the issue. And we need also to realize that some kinds of personalizations are just not okay. Those that address protected traits, sensitive data, of course, illegally harvested data, of course, but also addiction, vulnerabilities, these, whether provided or inferred, they cannot be the basis for personalization, and therefore we need to have a better regulation of how this is being dealt. And this includes also reversing the burden of proof. I, as a consumer, shouldn't have to prove that it's by design that the platform, which obviously shields itself as much as possible, has made the system as it is to make sure that I'm addicted and that my attention is captured all the time. I think if we address this systematically, we can reasonably and meaningfully have a rights-based approach that protects whole of society.
Thank you, Simon. Steffi, when we place these digital policies alongside increasingly hostile approaches towards migrants, refugees, and undocumented people, more bordering, more monitoring, more data extraction, aka the return hubs or the ongoing war on migrants in the Mediterranean, all of that, do you see that these as separate political developments or part of the same broader project of control and exclusion disguised in their different conversation?
It's absolutely the same broader political project, and I emphasize political because it's a choice that is consistently being made by heads of state, policymakers, and corporate giants. It is part of the general trend of the diversion of resources towards policing, surveillance, and control, and away from protection services, welfare services, healthcare, education, you name it. It is a fact that EU policy is increasingly dictated by this securitization lens and the constant pervasive argument that we are facing many existential threats, and therefore we need more control and more criminalization and more exclusion, even though, as Simeon mentioned, every other area is being heavily deregulated. Migration policy, as you mentioned, is one of the most overregulated policy areas of the European Union, and we can see the results of that. This is why I think it's important, again, to go back and interrogate this premise, this false binary that we're presented with of security versus autonomy or freedom, it's because it's inextricable from the context in which we live, which I would say is, we live in fascist times. It's not a coincidence. They are absolutely part of the same thing. I think most of us are old enough to remember, what it's like when the larger world is faced with these kind of like existential culture wars and real wars and increasingly genocide and impunity. We have always seen whatever pretext is available to people in power used to ramp up the surveillance state And now in the digital space, this happens with the complicity of large platforms that are so giant as to be unaccountable in any way. And those pretexts that I mentioned can be, yeah, protecting children, but it can also be, you know, oh, we do this migration policy because we need to protect asylum seekers from people smugglers. Well, we know that the impact of that is that this has been the most deadly year for people crossing the Mediterranean, you know, or combating gender-based violence while not listening to women, sex workers, queer people, you know, in any way. And all this contributes to this framework and infrastructure of, again, yes, criminalization, securitization, surveillance, control, punishment. And these are trends within and without digital spaces. And the impact is the same: less privacy, less rights, less freedom, mass surveillance. And I really want to emphasize that this is like an ongoing political choice. It's an active choice that the EU and others are building on existing trends of criminalization and securitization and increasingly militarization. And they manufacture scarcity and popular dissatisfaction and divisiveness within our societies. And I think a lot of tech companies are also complicit in that. And they have embedded themselves into political infrastructures as indispensable functions of state power and control. And that's really the issue, like across the board of what we're seeing, whether we're talking about protecting children online or migration policy or, yeah, anything like that. And I think it's always good to remember the complicity between political institutions and corporate powers, how profitable control is, how profitable war is, how profitable surveillance is, when tech multimillionaires and multinationals offer themselves as a solution to anything. It should kind of raise a little bit of a red flag for everybody. These are not benign or neutral entities. They are huge powers with the capacity to do harm, have huge influence over our infrastructures, and we need to have a more structural, critical analysis of the access we give big tech to our political institutions and to our lives. You know, it's not for them to decide what child safety means or what freedom means and how it's constructed. They cannot propose solutions to any of the problems we face because they are inherently self-serving and their solutionism is always geared towards profitability. And that's how that fits in with this broader trend of state and corporate control, criminalization, surveillance.
Preach, giving it to Simon.
A quick follow-up on that, exactly that. Age verification will only serve them because finding the risks and addressing the risks that are inherent to their business model and the way they design their system. These are duties they already have under the DSA. However, it is immensely profitable not to do that, not to question these practices and to go on as business as usual, even if that means for them kicking out part of their users, a small one, the youth, the young people. It is insanely profitable for them to not question what they do and to keep their harmful practices, because this ultimately is what their bread, how do you say in French, their pain béni. This method of protecting users is serving their interest, which is also why we have to be very cautious. It's a false solution which not only will harm young people and loads of other categories in the population of adults, but it also really helps them because they don't have to do all the hard work of making their service safe. That's really need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship which benefits both parties in this situation. You know, governments get to say, oh, we took a really hard line on child safety and protection. Vote for me, you know? It's like a win-win, except that we all lose.
Yeah, totally. And I think similarly to this rhetoric, this is the same thing happening for trans communities as well. I mean, with the pushback and the anti-gender movements and also like this, how how our people are attacked, whether when it comes to the gender diversity or the trans rights. Felix, how do policies like age verification and mandatory identifications shape access to online spaces for trans people, and how do they interact with this broader political climate? Do you think this is also by design meant to be like, oh, let's put age verification to protect children and then see who's trans and who's not? Or do you think it's just an intended consequence?
I mean, unfortunately, we live in a world right now where people, trans people, have to leave their home to move to another place because of persecution. And I mean, we've talked a lot about social media so far, but another aspect I think that is worth looking at is also instant messaging. So how do people actually organize something like that, like finding a place of safety, and not just finding community, but very kind of hard operational information about how do I get from A to B, where can I have access to healthcare and things like that. And for that, encrypted messaging services are extremely important. And one thing that we're seeing in the child protection debate is that encryption is increasingly framed as a threat. A threat where children can be exposed to grooming. And of course, that is a real danger. But if we try to address this issue by either outlawing encryption or saying, well, if you want to have an encrypted messaging app, you have to do age verification first, then you're basically saying that encrypted messaging is only going to be available to people who have identity documents and who are willing to use those identity documents to gain access to the service. So you are excluding exactly those populations from access to encrypted messaging who most need it because they are facing some kind of persecution. So I think we're in Europe, we're seeing this with ongoing negotiations on the chat control proposal, where we still don't know exactly where it's going to land on this question of encryption. But it's also something that we're seeing internationally. I think Meta has rolled back encryptions of private messages on Instagram, and it was also part of a regulatory push for more child protection. And so personally, I'm a big fan of tech regulation if it's done actually in a smart way, because first of all, there are people within tech companies who are trying to do the right thing, and they're sometimes quite happy if there is smart regulation that is making companies, for example, actually hire more people who work on trust and safety, for example. But if the laws set bad examples and they basically just incentivize companies to hire more people to build surveillance tools or to build age verification technologies or things like that, those resources are not going to be invested into what I think actually makes online communities safer, which is more people who are involved in the conversations there and who are active participants. I mean, we're seeing this also with online gaming spaces, for example, that usually the solutions to improve child safety in online spaces is not, they're social rather than technical in many cases. And well, that happens to be more expensive often. But so I would say, when it comes to tech regulation that actually works, try to set good incentives for companies to actually do the right thing. And I feel the DSA was like a pretty good example of that, which is also maybe why it's quite unpopular.
Fair. Anything good is not popular, actually. Louisa, now shifting the conversation towards movements. Movements have been raising concerns about all of what has been mentioned right now: the surveillance, censorship, the shrinking civic space for years. Yet policy discussions are often return to the same tools of restriction and control. From your perspective, what is currently missing in how movements are mobilizing or organizing around this?
I think what's missing is that is the idea that organized power can compete with fear. And I'm saying this because I was recently speaking to a tech advisor for the German Bundestag, and she told me that members of the Bundestag were coming to her very worried because they were receiving non-stop calls from parents asking for restrictive laws and for age verification and social media bans. And that was really striking for me, because then I wondered, why aren't we calling? Where are the calls from young people and youth organizations or digital rights movements asking them not to pass these kinds of laws? Where are the calls saying we want safety, we don't want bans, we want a future where our rights are not overridden for our own good? So I think here it's very clear what the struggle is that parents have a very clear emotional demand, which is protect my child at all costs. Policymakers understand that. Media understands that quite well. But the reality is that young people's relationship to digital spaces is much more complex. We know that platforms are harming us. We know that algorithmic manipulation and endless scroll and violence are real problems on social media spaces. But we also know that these spaces can also foster connection and community and so on. So I think the complexity here is that this complexity is harder to mobilize than fear. So I think that movements need to become much better at mobilizing around complexity. And we know that digital rights movements are stronger when when they're explaining why a policy is dangerous, but the pro-ban side is much stronger at creating public pressure. And I think that this is something we should all be aware of. So, because policymakers are hearing from scared parents, from moral panic, and youth-led alternatives remain underfunded, fragmented, under-resourced, or brought in too late. So we need to move from listen to young people to organize with young people. And, and this is gonna be part of a bigger movement, I hope, saying, don't pass laws in young people's names that they didn't ask for, that they do not trust, and that ultimately do not address the systems harming them. And this is part of what we're trying to do with Equilabs. We recently launched a campaign with EDRI, where we signed an open letter with other 31 youth organizations and youth activists responding to this rise of age gate. And that was quite well taken. I was very proud of it, but I think this is not enough. So we need more ways for young people to move from collective stories to collective demands. And then we need to also create some infrastructure where young people and youth organizations can contact policymakers, can shape public narratives. And I'm saying this because here is a space where a lot of people have quite easy access to, they know how to mobilize around this, right? So why aren't we mobilizing together? And I will again plug Equilabs here because we are currently organizing a project where we want to gather teenagers' perspectives on age verification and social media bans, and then bring these views directly into policy spaces. So if you are working on this or you would like to work on this, please talk to us after. I would be very happy to do it. But I think the main argument here is that if fear is organized, then rights and empowerment should be organized as well.
Oh, actually, you said something very interesting to me, because organizations that are already being consulted from a governmental level are those who have access to these spaces. So how organizations are also playing a role in making this complicity for us not being invited to this conversation, be it the trans communities, be it the undocumented communities, be it the young communities who don't have access to the normal, what seem to be normal patterns to have access to this conversation, like you need to have a degree or whatever. So how do you think these movements should share these powers?
I mean, I think it's first recognizing your privilege, understanding that if you are in a space and there are so many people like you, maybe you're part of the problem. And I'm not saying this to punish anybody or to blame anybody, but I think just to understand how powerful we are as allies and how intergenerational allyship can change things. But you also need to be able to let go perhaps of your own prejudices and be like, well, actually, young people do have the knowledge and capacities to organize perhaps better than I do or our organization does. So I think this kind of mea culpa is
Totally
necessary.
Totally, because I think from my end, I also say this, that I think the far right movements, or when it comes to these policies that are restrictive, they are more organized than we are. And I think I'm going to give them that. We should learn to how to organize from these movements, because we're clearly not.
100%.
But yeah, with that silly idea apart, at the moment, where decisions about digital spaces are increasingly being made without the meaningful participation of the most affected, as we emphasized on, what is one thing and one thing only, policymakers urgently need to understand about youth autonomy and online life? 1 minute per each speaker. Do not exceed that.
I'll try to brief then. Well, I guess understand that when you turn 18, it doesn't flip a switch in your brain where you're suddenly mature and able to deal with all of the bad things online. And equally, if you're below 18 and you are using the internet as a way to learn new skills, to organize, that can be extremely powerful and shape the entire rest of your life in a positive way.
I'll be cheeky and say two things, but I'll be fast. The first is that I would really like to remind policymakers what it was like to be a child. Like, I'm pretty far off being a child at this point, but like, I do firmly believe that being a child is essentially, for any child ever, living under authoritarianism. You are subject to the tyranny of everybody around you who has more power than you, which is everybody. And it's awful, and it's not nice, and nobody, I think, would begrudge children the right to be treated as agents of their own like destiny or future. And the second thing is that I would really ask them, beyond digital spaces, the other things that exist in their world and how to support them. I think most young people would say they want other things before they want social media regulation: green spaces, third spaces, more educational opportunities, I don't know, like free school meals. You know, I think there's a huge list of priorities that come before any of this. And what that would necessitate from policymakers is a redirection of resources away from control and into welfare and social services.
Very shortly. I wish they remember I wish they realize, policymakers, how tremendously positive the impact can be from social media, online spaces in general. These places, although toxic now, have a tremendous potential to be liberating and to enhance our capability to exercise our rights autonomously. If we disempower young people and exclude loads of people from online spaces, the risks are so immense for society as a whole to be able to express and research the information they need. I think what they need to realize is that if they push along this narrative and this direction of restriction, it will just not work. Young people will not want to abide by that and will just bypass en masse, like in Australia, like in China, like everywhere else. A blank space is not something they want to be in.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would like them to understand that autonomy is part of safety, that young people are safer when they have rights, when they have information, when they have a say in rules that shape their lives. And we also have to understand that for most young people, online life is not separate from their real lives. So online is also where they're learning how to flirt, how to organize, how to make mistakes, how to find community. So when policymakers regulate online life without young people, they are also regulating how young people become social and political beings. So there is a lot to do in that space, but that is not through exclusion. And if digital rights are made for young people but without them, it will keep confusing protection with control. And young people can really tell that. So it's just not useful.
We can really tell that.
We can really tell that.
Thank you. Back to you, dear audience. The floor is open. Do we have a question? We have 1, we have 2, we have 3, we have 4. I'm going to try to remember. We have 5. We have 15 minutes. We're going to try to make it.
Who do you want?
Thank you. Amazing panel. Right.
Please go, we don't have time.
No, yeah, amazing panel, and yeah, if only CPDP could have 100 of these panels. So yeah, my question was, so maybe rapidly introduce myself. I'm Giancarlo Margeri. I'm leading a project at Leiden University about social media, resilience and vulnerability, and we are trying to adopt the same transversal approach without labeling anybody, but looking at power imbalance. I really liked the alliance discussion. So usually law has vulnerability as a competence, mental, age, and vulnerability as a traditional marginalization, like ethnicity, sexual orientation. But here we are seeing that the two things are connected. So I loved the reference to the children are marginalized also. So in very practical terms, now we are trying to advise the Dutch government for some policy. And two things that come from your panel, but I wanted to ask for additional points. I think one is participation, okay? Participatory impact assessment, participatory practices. The problem is money, I guess. And the second problem is how to intermediate with children, right? So we need competence. We need people that can intermediate. We cannot just say, come, tell us. We need experts in pedagogy, etc., that can intermediate. If you have any insight on that. And the second point is we might want to have specific, we don't want to ban people, we want to ban practices. And we fully agree with that. But there's also the idea of layered protection. So to have an environment that is safer based on dependency. But the problem is that if we ask social media or even chatbots, this is something we didn't touch upon today, but that's also there, to protect groups on the basis of their dependency, we are asking them to profile their vulnerability. So there's always this conflict with profiling. And if you have any insight on that, I would love that.
Yeah, maybe some thoughts.
Let's do this because we don't have time. Let's take more questions and then please do take notes on your phones or something. And then maybe we can answer collectively. We have one there
So,
and then that queen in there. Okay.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you. It resonates to me, not just as an immigrant, but also as a cognitive scientist specialized in human needs, and also as someone in information system working on digital protection for years. I don't want to repeat what you said. It was brilliant, all of the things that you said, but there is a big but here. I think the imaginary that you had also was, to some extent, based on the existing system, that on the user side, nothing can happen. I didn't hear it from you. We have currently the discussion on Article 88B, potential Article 88B of GDPR, that for the first time in the history of internet, I would say, it allows the user to have a bidirectional right layer between data controllers or service provider, whatever you want to call it, with the user. Age, for example, even in some cases, even if we imagine there should be an age check, not always, I agree with you, there will be a lot of marginalization. That should not necessarily happen on the controller part. It can also, in a potential imaginary, easily, we already have implemented it in Vienna, on the user side. Control can happen on the user side. It should not be one size fits all. We can personalize it, not through the social media, not through the big tech, on the user device, in the user device, with participation of the person, like the youth or child, parents, guardians, experts, whoever else, and make it sure that many of the matters that you actually correctly, really very correctly point to, can be addressed in a very new way of looking at the way internet should function as a system. Maybe this would be actually a potential homework for us. Looking to 88B can see what it can do, not just for privacy, for every single other rights, in particular child rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we give the microphone to the queen over there?
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this panel. I am Anonella. I am the Policy Officer for Digital Rights with the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance. There's so many parallels between our movement and the children's rights movement, including the rights not rescue approach. And I would love to hear you talk about porn, because this discussion oftentimes is like, well, you know, social media for sure, we shouldn't age gate. But then when we turn to porn, the kind of discussion goes into, yeah, that should totally be age gate. That is off the discussion. And as if, you know, when you're magically 18, then you're okay to interact with porn and you're going to know how to do that. And porn is often used as the strawman argument to kind of call for this general ban. So I'd love if you could go a little bit into that. Thank you.
If we don't have that expertise, would you be open to share with us your insights about that conversation?
Sure,
Awesome.
absolutely.
We'll come back to you. Can we get another queen? Because we've heard from 2 men already. Another queen? We have another queen. Oh, 2 queens. Great.
Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting panel, and I want to give as much time as possible for everyone to ask questions. But we didn't manage to talk a lot about the issue of consent and also assent. So I used to work in like child's data protection. I supported a lot of a DPO with making consent forms. And one of the things we really valued was assent forms, asking children. We spoke so much about empowering young people, empowering youth, and sometimes just asking them like, okay, your parents gave consent to give your data, but do you agree? You can also say no, you can rescind consent. And I think it's a really powerful tool. I know in data protection, we criticize it a lot as not being valuable enough, but still the ability to say yes or no, or I agreed, then maybe I don't now, is great. And I think it's something that helps a lot for empowering youth online.
Thank you. One last question, and then we can move to the answers. And then if we have time, we can open it again. Sorry, young man.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Belgian Data Protection Authority, and from the policymaker point of view, the big question is how to imply young people, children, in building a good protection for them and to aware them on risk, on problem that they can have online, but also to help them to manage it and to collaborate with them. How can they also help us to understand a little bit better and to do it better?
Great. I think that's a great final answer question, because I think it's
Thank
very
you.
connected to the first question about participation. Who wants to take the floor for that?
I can start and then we can. I'm gonna do a little bit of a blend just because we have 7 minutes. I think that we need to first understand a little bit of what I said before about our own biases, right? So I think we have this bias that young people don't know how to participate or how to mobilize or how to assess their risks, but do we know how to assess our risks? Do you know how to assess your risks? And I think that this also comes in on kind of the agency side. I think that you would be surprised that when you give the floor to young people, to teenagers, to children, that they actually have a lot to say, that they actually know what they want and what they need. Like a girl being harassed on TikTok knows exactly what she needs to stop being harassed because she's seeing who's harassing her. So I think that we need to open more spaces where these conversations can happen and maybe take a step back in giving what they need instead of having a more passive role and letting them develop and then supporting, resourcing, etc.
Great. Anybody has some insights on this conversation? Felix, maybe.
Yeah, I think civil society organizations are really important as an intermediary there, because likely as a DPA, you're not going to go on the street and ask a random child about their opinion. So I think, it was mentioned earlier, unfortunately, it costs money, right? So we're seeing, I'm more familiar with the situation in Germany, where a lot of funding for democracy-oriented civil society is being cut. And I think we really need to do the exact opposite. And now we've heard from the Netherlands, we've heard from Belgium. These are not poor countries, so I think it is possible to increase funding for civil society and make that part of the strategy. Because, I think if you want to hear from young people in regulatory discussions, you need to actively create the fora where they can have a voice. And I think there are civil society, democracy-oriented programs such as like youth parliaments and things like this are a really great way of doing this. And perhaps one more point on the question, like what could the Dutch government look at? I think one area that is under investigated is advertisement, because when we are talking about a lot of these features that might be toxic, it's always a question, is the person who is using the platform being treated as a customer or not? And if the customer is the advertiser, then of course the incentive structure for the platforms is quite different. So I think, if we need to approach this from the perspective of, if we pass this law, what do we think is going to happen? How are the companies going to react to it? And there, I think advertising plays an important role.
To be honest, I'll be slightly critical about the money question. I think a lot of youth are willing to, we are working voluntarily, and I think a lot of times, governments say, oh, we don't have money, we cannot call in youth, and we cannot sponsor them and all of these things, so we cannot have these conversations because now we don't have money. But a lot of us show up for free, and we're still willing to show up for free. Not that I'm encouraging the free labor. No, I need money. But we're still showing up. But then I think the conversation about money is also very restrictive. It's like, we don't have money, youth are not invited, period. But I think it shouldn't be that way. But there is money. It's a billionaire kind of field, so I think there is money. But never mind. Stiffy, Simon, do you have anything to add, especially about consent? Because actually for the porn conversation, I want to hand it over to you back. I don't want to tokenize that conversation. So anything about consent and the question over there?
One point that is really important is, of course, consent and assent is extremely important in the empowerment of young people themselves and of everyone else involved in these online spaces. However, focus on consent, on transparency, and other individual, narrow approaches is bound to fail if we don't address the systemic issue, which is how the systems are designed. It's pitched against us. There's no way we can win against addiction and toxic content through our own twitching of the settings on the app. We need to go beyond that, which is why we call also for something broader than that. On how to involve youth, well, of course, if youth, young persons, youth representatives, youth organizations are invited and heard but not listened to, if their input doesn't have impact on measures which are already decided at political level and which political parties need to keep a line on, well, it sounds meaningless, and it is actually quite dispiriting. So involving them needs to go through organizations that represent them. It cannot be a token. It cannot be a last minute or late thought. It cannot be just a study on a poll on the internet. It has to be more meaningful than that. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being actually harmful to their participation.
Steffi, one last word?
Yeah, maybe just very quickly. I think everybody who's been a young person on the internet knows how to bypass, use a VPN to get around things like that. It's just age verification in general. It's just a very inelegant solution to anything, and it's so broad brush as well that, in trying to reduce young people's access to porn, you're also reducing their access to sex education content and things like that. It's an inelegant solution. It's hammer on the whatever, and I don't know, it doesn't, I don't know that it helps anything. We have experts in the room who I'm sure would be better placed to answer that, but that's just to kind of, instinctually.
Right, Timon, can I invite you, please, as a guest, as a final guest speaker, just so we can share your insights about this as well, because I think it's very important to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much for having the floor. Just to paying that, so when it comes to porn, there is a lot of fear around it, and the porn industry is far from perfect. However, kids want to see porn because they want to know what sex looks like, right? The sex education that we're giving them is is failing them, and they're curious about the pleasure part, the connection part, so they go online to seek porn. And there is also a really big difference between someone encountering porn by accident, someone who is under 10, and someone who's 17 and using a VPN to bypass the age gate because they want to watch porn. So we should address that with comprehensive pleasure inclusive sex education, and that includes porn literacy. Because when you turn 18, you're not magically capable of interacting with porn. And porn literacy has to be age appropriate. There is a brilliant project called The Porn Conversation by Erica Lust. I was fortunate enough to contribute to it, and they have resources for parents and for teachers, for caregivers. They are age appropriate for you to start this conversation, so you can empower children and give them autonomy to engage with porn consensually and safely, because the age gates, not only they are exclusionary, but they also don't address the problem that this can squash the porn industry, in the sense that, you know, smaller studios, queer studios, the ones that represent, you know, gender expensive sexuality, don't have the money to implement this age verification verification technologies. And what that means is that we're going to have, you know, a porn landscape that is just mainstream. So this is just my take on it. Thank you so much for giving me the floor.
Thank you for willing to share all of this with us. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you to the panelists, Louisa, Simon, Steffi, and Felix. And thank you to the diva out there that shared her insight. Thank you to you two for listening. And yeah, see you around the corner. Have fun around.